Chapter 1. The Origins of the Samurai. In the distant past, before the samurai became the eternal symbol of Japan, the islands of the archipelago were shaped by conflict, survival, and shifting power. Japan was not yet a unified nation. Instead, it was a land of competing clans, each bound by blood and tradition, each fighting to control fertile fields, rivers, and trade. At the center of this fractured land sat the emperor and his court, wrapped in elegance and ritual, dwelling in palaces where poetry and refinement defined existence. But this glittering world of silk and ceremony was fragile, a beautiful illusion detached from the harsher realities beyond the capital. In the countryside, farmers bent their backs over rice fields while bandits prowled the forests. Rebellions sparked like brush fires, and distant provinces often ignored imperial decrees. It was in this gap between the aristocratic court and the unstable provinces that a new kind of warrior began to emerge. At first, they were not noblemen. They were simply men asked to fight. Farmers who picked up bows, hunters who turned their skills toward war, protectors who guarded estates against rivals and thieves. They were practical and rough, born not from luxury, but necessity. Over time, however, their role expanded. They became known as bushi, men of war, and their lives began to revolve around the duties of combat and loyalty. Slowly, generation after generation, they transformed from improvised militias into a distinct class. From these beginnings, the samurai would take shape. The transformation accelerated during the Heian period, which began in the late 8th century. In the capital of Heian-kyo, today's Kyoto, courtiers lived lives of extraordinary refinement. They wrote delicate verses, debated the beauty of flowers, and engaged in endless rituals of elegance. But while nobles immersed themselves in aesthetics, the provinces grew restless. Local lords could not rely on the distant court for protection, and so they turned to warriors, men who could enforce order with the bow, the sword, and the horse. These warriors served not as independent agents, but as retainers, bound to the service of great families. It was here that the word samurai began to appear, meaning one who serves. It was not yet a title of glory, but it carried within it the seed of what would become one of the most revered identities in Japanese history. As the decades passed, certain clans grew powerful enough to rival the authority of the imperial court itself. Among them were the Taira and the Minamoto, two families whose names would echo through the ages. At first, they acted as enforcers for the aristocracy, suppressing uprisings and maintaining order. But ambition and rivalry soon pushed them beyond service. Their battles became struggles for dominance, their victories reshaping the future of the nation. By the late 12th century, their rivalry erupted into open conflict, the Genpei War. For 5 brutal years, Japan was torn apart. Warriors thundered across battlefields on horseback, arrows cutting through the air, swords clashing in the chaos of combat. This was not just a war of power, but a proving ground for the emerging identity of the samurai. They fought not as faceless soldiers, but as individuals eager to carve their names into memory. Before battles, warriors would call out their ancestry, daring their enemies to meet them in single combat. Honor was their weapon as much as steel, and to die bravely was to preserve one's name forever. The war climaxed at Dan-no-ura in 1185, a dramatic naval battle where the Taira were crushed and their remnants scattered into history. The Minamoto emerged victorious, and with their triumph came the dawn of a new era. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, seizing for himself the title of shogun, military ruler of Japan. The emperor still sat on his throne, but his power was hollow. The true authority now belonged to the warriors. Japan had entered the age of the samurai. The consequences of this shift were immense. The samurai were no longer provincial fighters tied loosely to local lords. They became the backbone of the political system, a class distinct from farmers, artisans, and merchants. To be samurai was to be part of an elite, bound by loyalty and rewarded with land or stipends, but also burdened with unyielding responsibility. Their entire existence revolved around service, to protect, to obey, to fight, and to die if necessary. Their weapons became symbols of that duty, especially the bow, which in these early centuries was more important than the sword. Mounted archery was the true art of the samurai in their beginnings. Battles were decided by volleys of arrows fired from horseback, and contests of archery were as much training as they were ritual displays of discipline. Yet over time, another weapon rose to prominence: the curved, gleaming blade that would become synonymous with their name. The katana. Forged with painstaking skill, it was more than a tool of death. It was regarded as the very soul of its bearer. To lose it was to lose honor. To wield it was to shoulder responsibility. The katana came to embody the warrior's spirit in a way no other weapon could. But the samurai were not defined solely by arms. Their rise was shaped just as much by philosophy and spirituality. The influence of Zen Buddhism instilled in them calmness before death, clarity in action, and the ability to meet combat without fear. The teachings of Confucianism emphasized hierarchy and loyalty, embedding within them the belief that their lives were tied to duty above all else. To be a samurai was to live with the certainty that death could come at any moment, and that when it did, one must face it with dignity. By the close of the 12th century, the transformation was complete. What had begun as farmers armed for defense had become a hereditary class of warriors who now dictated the fate of Japan. Their rise marked the birth of a feudal society where loyalty, honor, and martial skill determined the course of power. The samurai were no longer just guardians of fields or enforcers of lords. They were Japan's rulers, its protectors, and its defining symbol. The court of poetry and silk had given way to a world ruled by steel and blood. And in this new world, the samurai stood unchallenged, prepared to shape the centuries to come. Chapter 2: The Code and the Life of the Warrior. To understand the samurai at the height of their power, it is not enough to see them only as fighters on horseback or swordsmen on the battlefield. Their true essence lay in a way of life, a system of values and discipline that set them apart from all others. By the time Japan entered its feudal age, the samurai were not merely warriors who lived by the sword. They were a class defined by a code, bound by loyalty, and shaped by rituals that dictated everything from how they fought to how they died. The life of a samurai was as much about honor as it was about survival, and that distinction gave rise to one of the most enduring ideals in human history. The world of the samurai revolved around service. They were not independent knights, free to choose their battles. Their very name, samurai, meant one who serves. Their existence was tied to the will of their lords, the daimyo, who ruled provinces and territories. The bond between a lord and his warrior was absolute. A samurai's loyalty was not a matter of convenience, but of identity. To betray one's lord was to betray oneself, and such disloyalty could erase a name from history. This relationship of service, reward, and obedience became the foundation of the feudal system in Japan, a structure that endured for centuries. But the obligations of a samurai extended beyond war. From the moment of birth, children in samurai families were raised with discipline. Boys were taught not only how to fight, but how to carry themselves, how to speak, and how to respect hierarchy. Their training began with archery and swordsmanship, but it did not end there. They practiced calligraphy to steady the hand, studied poetry to sharpen the mind, and meditated to calm the spirit. Even the arts were part of their preparation for war. For to the samurai, battle was as much mental as it was physical. A mind clouded by fear or anger could not remain steady in the chaos of combat. Central to their identity was the acceptance of death. A true samurai was expected to live every day with the knowledge that his life could end at any moment. Death was not an enemy to be feared, but a reality to be embraced. The warrior who did not fear death fought with clarity, with courage, with a sharpness that came from having nothing left to lose. This acceptance gave rise to rituals of self-sacrifice, most famously seppuku, the ritual act of taking one's own life to preserve honor. To Western eyes, this might appear as a grim tragedy, but to the samurai, it was the ultimate expression of loyalty and integrity, a way to die on one's own terms rather than live in disgrace. It was in this context that the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was born. Not written as a single document, not dictated by one authority, Bushido emerged gradually, shaped by centuries of custom, philosophy, and example. It blended the spiritual calm of Zen Buddhism with the moral rigor of Confucianism, the reverence for nature found in Shinto, and the practical demands of constant warfare. It called upon the warrior to be loyal, disciplined, honest, and courageous. It demanded respect for one's lord, compassion for the weak, and humility in the face of life's impermanence. The samurai's weapons were also bound to this code. The sword, above all, was regarded as sacred. The katana was not carried lightly. To draw it was to cross a threshold, for its edge represented both justice and death. Families passed swords down from generation to generation, imbuing them with the weight of history. When a warrior carried his blade, he was carrying more than steel. He bore the honor of his ancestors and the reputation of his house. To lose a sword was to lose a part of oneself. Yet the life of the warrior was not all solemnity. The samurai lived in a world filled with rituals of beauty and refinement that balanced their martial discipline. They attended tea ceremonies that embodied harmony and respect. They wrote haiku, small poems capturing fleeting moments of nature and thought. They contemplated gardens designed to reflect the calmness of the mind. In this way, the samurai's life fused violence and art, ferocity and serenity. They were both destroyers and creators, soldiers and poets. This duality is part of what has made their image endure across centuries. Still, beneath all of this, the reality of a samurai's life was not always as noble as the code suggested. They were, after all, men bound to lords and clans who pursued power and wealth. Wars were waged not only for ideals, but for land and resources. Many samurai lived lives of hardship, away from glory, defending remote estates or patrolling dangerous roads. The myth of Bushido sometimes stood apart from the practical struggles of survival. Yet even so, the ideals remained powerful. shaping how warriors saw themselves and how they wished to be remembered. The education of a samurai was relentless. Martial training began at dawn and could last for hours, whether in archery fields, practicing horseback riding, or rehearsing sword techniques. Young warriors learned the art of strategy by studying Chinese classics and historical battles. They were told stories of great generals, of victories gained not only through strength, but through cunning. A samurai's value was measured not simply by his ability to kill, but by his ability to command, to plan, and to anticipate the movements of his enemies. This life created a unique mentality, one that blended humility with pride, simplicity with grandeur. The samurai was expected to live modestly, without excess, even as he carried a weapon that symbolized unmatched power. His home was simple, his meals humble, yet his spirit was elevated by duty and discipline. Wealth was not measured in gold, but in reputation, not in possessions, but in the loyalty of comrades and the honor of one's name. Women of samurai families, though often overshadowed in history, also lived by this code. They were taught to defend their homes in times of crisis, and sometimes carried the short sword, the tanto, for protection. They too were expected to embody loyalty and endurance, raising children with the same values of discipline and service. The household itself became an extension of the warrior's duty, a place where honor was preserved not only in battle, but in daily life. The culmination of this life was the readiness to die for one's lord. When called to battle, the samurai did not hesitate. Their armor, crafted with intricate design, was donned with ritual care. Each piece carried meaning, each gesture tied to tradition. The helmet with its fierce crest, the mask that concealed the face, the layered plates that protected the body, all served not only as defense, but as symbols of identity. To see a line of samurai prepared for war was to see centuries of discipline embodied in steel and silk, a living testament to their code. In this way, the life of the samurai was more than just fighting. It was an existence woven with duty, beauty, and constant awareness of mortality. The code of Bushido bound them to their lords, to their families, to their ancestors, and to the very spirit of Japan itself. For the samurai, to live was to serve, and to serve was to be ready to die. Their code was not a set of rules on parchment, it was the rhythm of their lives, as inseparable from them as their swords and their souls. By the time the samurai class reached its peak, they had become far more than warriors. They were symbols of an ideal, a fusion of strength and restraint, power and humility, violence and grace. They stood as examples of how discipline can shape destiny, how loyalty can create order from chaos, and how a single code of honor can define an entire civilization. Chapter 3: Weapons, Battles, and Power. To speak of the samurai without speaking of their weapons and their wars would be to leave their story incomplete. The samurai were not only a class of disciplined men who served their lords with loyalty, they were warriors whose lives were defined by conflict. Their power, their reputation, their very identity was forged in the smoke of battle and in the perfection of the tools they carried. For centuries, their weapons and strategies set them apart, and their skill in combat allowed them to dominate Japan's history. Yet their relationship with war was more than physical. For the samurai, weapons were extensions of the soul, and the battlefield was a place where honor and destiny were tested in equal measure. In their earliest centuries, the samurai were horsemen and archers, warriors who fought with bow and arrow long before the curved sword became their defining mark. Archery was not simply a skill, but an art, one that demanded balance, patience, and precision. From horseback, a samurai could release arrows while galloping at full speed, striking with a deadly accuracy that stunned his enemies. Battles often began with volleys of arrows that darkened the skies, each shot carrying not only the weight of survival, but the pride of the warrior who released it. The way of the bow and horse, Kyuba no Michi, was at the heart of the samurai's life in these early days. But Japan's warfare evolved, and with it, so did the samurai's arsenal. As clans expanded and territories grew larger, battles became more brutal and more personal. The bow remained a symbol of discipline, but the weapon that would come to define the samurai above all was the katana. Forged with meticulous care by master swordsmiths, the katana was unlike any other blade in the world. Its curved edge, sharpened to near perfection, allowed for swift, precise strikes. It could cut down an enemy with a single movement, but its value was never only practical. To the samurai, the katana was the soul of the warrior. It was a sacred bond between man and steel, an object treated with reverence, passed down as an heirloom, and believed to embody the spirit of its wielder. The forging of a sword was itself a ritual steeped in tradition and spirituality. Swordsmiths prayed as they worked, purifying themselves before beginning. The folding of steel again and again was not only a technique to strengthen the blade, but also a metaphor for purification, for resilience, for perfection achieved through repeated trial. To hold a finished katana was to hold centuries of tradition, years of training, and the hope of victory. A warrior without his sword was incomplete, stripped of identity, dishonored in the eyes of his peers. Alongside the katana came the wakizashi, the shorter companion sword. Together, they formed the daisho, the big little pair, a visible sign that the man who carried them was samurai. The daisho was not only a practical set of weapons, but a badge of rank, a declaration of belonging to the warrior class. In times of peace, the daisho served as constant reminders of duty. In times of war, they were instruments of life and death. The samurai did not fight alone. Their power was magnified through strategy and through the armies they commanded. The wars of medieval Japan were clashes not of individuals, but of clans, each battle a test of collective strength and loyalty. Castles rose across the landscape, strongholds of stone and wood that became centers of power and symbols of dominance. Samurai were trained not only to fight, but to defend and to siege, to outthink as much as to outfight. Their wars were not random chaos, but orchestrated conflicts, where tactics could determine the fate of provinces. In the heat of battle, armor played as vital a role as weapons. Samurai armor was not the heavy steel of European knights, but a lighter, more flexible construction of lacquered plates and silk cords. Designed for mobility, it allowed the warrior to ride, to shoot, and to strike with agility. The helmets were often adorned with crests that displayed the clan's identity, while masks added both protection and terror, transforming human faces into the visages of demons. To meet a line of armored samurai was to encounter a wall of fearsome figures whose appearance was as much psychological as it was defensive. The wars themselves were as much about loyalty as they were about victory. To fight for one's lord was not a choice but a duty, and death in his service was considered noble. Betrayal was punished not only with death, but with disgrace that extended to one's family for generations. This sense of collective honor bound warriors together, making their armies strong, not only in numbers, but in conviction. As the centuries progressed, new weapons entered the battlefield. Spears and pole arms, such as the naginata, extended a warrior's reach and became crucial in large-scale combat. The naginata, wielded with sweeping motions, was both elegant and deadly, able to cut down cavalry and infantry alike. Firearms, too, would eventually arrive with the Portuguese in the 16th century, introducing the matchlock arquebus to Japanese warfare. At first resisted, they were soon embraced, reshaping battlefields and forcing even the proud samurai to adapt. Yet, even as gunpowder weapons spread, the image of the sword remained unshaken in the heart of samurai culture. The battlefield was also a stage for individual valor. Samurai often sought out duels in the midst of chaos, calling their names and challenging foes to meet them face to face. Victories were remembered in tales and passed down through generations, their reputations immortalized in poetry and song. To die bravely was to live forever, and many warriors met their end not in defeat, but in acts of defiance that turned them into legends. Power in Japan flowed from these conflicts. Clans that triumphed on the battlefield rose to prominence, their leaders becoming shoguns, their warriors rewarded with land and privilege. The cycle of loyalty, war, and reward created a society where military power was inseparable from political authority. A daimyo's strength was measured not in wealth alone, but in the number and skill of the samurai who fought under his banner. The fate of Japan was determined again and again by these shifting balances of power, by victories that reshaped the nation, and by defeats that erased clans from history. Yet behind every battle lay the code. Even as war consumed the land, the ideals of Bushido guided the warrior's heart. Victory without honor was hollow, and survival without loyalty was worse than death. The battlefield then was not only a place of violence, but a place where the true measure of a samurai was revealed. Did he fight with courage? Did he remain loyal to his lord? Did he die with dignity? These questions mattered as much as tactics or numbers, for they defined not just the outcome of wars, but the legacy of those who fought them. Weapons, battles, and power were inseparable in the story of the samurai. The bow, the sword, the spear, the armor, the castle, all were tools that shaped their world. But it was not steel alone that gave the samurai their dominance. It was the discipline to wield these weapons with purpose, the loyalty to fight with conviction, and the code that made honor more valuable than life itself. Across centuries, their wars carved the destiny of Japan, and their weapons became symbols that outlived them. The legacy of these battles is still felt today. The katana remains revered as an object of beauty and perfection. The stories of great duels still inspire awe. The image of the armored samurai, resolute and unyielding, remains one of the most powerful icons of Japanese culture. Their weapons were more than tools, their battles were more than conflicts, their power was more than political. Together, they were the embodiment of a way of life, one that defined a civilization and continues to fascinate the world. Chapter 4. Decline and Legacy of the Samurai. For centuries, the samurai defined Japan's fate, their discipline setting the rhythm of politics and war. Yet no order endures forever. What begins as necessity becomes tradition, and what survives by the sword must eventually face a world that no longer answers to steel. The decline of the samurai was not an instant disaster, not a single battle lost or a decree signed in haste. It was a long unwinding, a slow change of seasons in which power migrated from horseback to bureaucracy, from arrow flights to ledgers, from castle walls to the machinery of a modern state. Their end, when it finally came, was simply the last footfall of a journey already in motion. The first hints of that journey appeared during the age of constant war itself. In the 16th century, Japan fractured into 1,000 ambitions, each province ruled by a daimyo, nursing hunger for more land and more vassals. Samurai thrived in this cauldron. It was the proving ground of reputations and the forge of legend. But in the furnace of the Sengoku period, change crept in under the smoke. New tactics spread across the archipelago. Drilling, logistics, massed infantry, and earthwork fortifications began to matter as much as gallant charges. Most disruptive of all was the thunder of unfamiliar weapons, the matchlock guns brought by traders from across the sea. A lord who used them well could remake the rules of battle in an afternoon. Oda Nobunaga understood this sooner than most. He did not worship tradition. He broke it to get results. On battlefields like Nagashino, he arranged ranks of arquebusiers behind palisades, coordinated their volleys, and cut down cavalry that had seemed unassailable for generations. The old image of dueling champions did not disappear, but it no longer decided the day. Fire and smoke, timing and discipline began to rule. From Nobunaga, the lesson passed to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who took these new methods and applied them to the country itself. Castle after castle surrendered. Daimyo after daimyo bent the knee. Hideyoshi staged the famous sword hunts to ensure that fighting remained the business of the warrior class. But even as he fixed the social order, the logic of warfare was being rewritten beneath his feet. When Tokugawa Ieyasu triumphed at Sekigahara in 1600 and established a shogunate that would last for more than 2 centuries, the paradox of samurai life sharpened into view. The warrior class had achieved its grandest victory, and with it, peace. The land settled. Roads were patrolled, borders stabilized, villages registered, and taxes counted in rice. The samurai did not vanish. Far from it. They became the pillars that held up the Tokugawa regime. But pillars do not gallop. Under the new order, many warriors moved from the field to the office. Scribes, magistrates, tax assessors, castle-town administrators who still wore 2 swords, yet signed documents more often than they drew steel. The shogunate maintained peace by design. Alternate attendance required daimyo to keep lavish residences in Edo and spend every other year under the shogun's watchful eye, their families effectively hostages of order. Great roads laced the country, post stations thrived, and an economy of merchants and artisans blossomed in the shade of samurai authority. A rigid hierarchy sorted society into 4 estates by ideal: warriors, farmers, artisans, merchants, but reality did not care about symbols. Rice stipends paid to retainers were fixed by tradition, even as money increasingly governed daily life. Merchants learned to turn profit into influence, and in the markets of Osaka and Edo, cash could do things a sword could not. For many samurai, this new world demanded a different kind of courage. Pride had to stand beside arithmetic. Households accustomed to command now reckoned interest and debt. Some families sold heirlooms to keep appearances. Some took positions as teachers and inspectors. Some sank quietly into poverty. Others became ronin, masterless men, drifting between small posts, guarding storehouses, or instructing in the martial arts. The story of the 47 ronin, whether read as justice or stubborn revenge, resonated because it revealed a tension at the heart of the age, a code formed in battle, trying to breathe in a time of paperwork. Yet the Tokugawa peace was not sterile. It nurtured thought. Neo-Confucian ideals gave the regime moral backbone. Zen practice still refined the mind, and Rangaku, Dutch learning, filtered knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and technology through a narrow maritime gate at Nagasaki. Castle towns became cultured centers, and the tea room, the dojo, and the study formed a triangle around samurai life. Armor was still lacquered, swords were still polished, but the sharpest edges were often philosophical. If death might come rarely now, dignity in life became its own examination. Even so, a closed country cannot keep the sea from its shores. In the 19th century, the waves delivered steam and iron. When American black ships loomed off Edo Bay in 1853, their smokestacks and cannons announced a truth that no edict could muffle. The world had changed without asking Japan's permission. Treaties followed, unequal, humiliating, and the question of how to respond cracked the political order. Should the country expel the barbarians by force or adapt and learn? Could the shogunate survive a crisis it seemed unable to manage? In whispers and proclamations, the old slogan rose, "Revere the emperor, expel the foreigners." But slogans do not move industry or raise armies equipped for the modern age. The Boshin War made these arguments into gunfire. Domains like Satsuma and Choshu, once checked by shogunal power, gathered reformers, modernizers, and idealists under banners claiming loyalty to the throne. Samurai stood on both sides, some defending the Tokugawa, some demanding its end, and their last great civil war unfolded from Toba Fushimi to the surrender of Edo and on to the northern frontiers. The imperial cause prevailed, and with victory came a mandate to remake the nation swiftly, or be broken by those already remade beyond its shores. The Meiji Restoration was a restoration in name and a revolution in fact. Titles changed, hairstyles changed, uniforms changed, but beneath the visible, the deep structure of Japan shifted with astonishing speed. The domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures. A national army based on general conscription replaced hereditary service. Land taxes were monetized. Railways unspooled across the islands. Factories rose beside rivers, and shipyards hammered wood into steam and then steel. The new state needed engineers, accountants, and officers trained in modern science. It did not need thousands of hereditary swordsmen paid in rice. Year by year, the privileges that set samurai apart were unwound. Stipends were converted to government bonds that paid predictably but poorly. Top knots were discouraged, then mocked, then abandoned. The right to wear swords in public shrank until the sword, that shining badge of identity, belonged mostly to uniformed soldiers and police. With the sword edict, the last visible privilege of a class gave way to the requirements of a centralized state. A sign you were someone became a sign you were out of step. It was not only pay or hairstyle that altered, it was the axis of pride. Change of that speed leaves behind those who cannot or will not keep pace. In Satsuma, where the memory of leading the revolution was still hot, discontent boiled. Many former samurai felt betrayed. They had toppled the old, only to find themselves unneeded in the new. Saigo Takamori emerged as their emblem, a man of principle caught between affection for the past and loyalty to a future he had helped open but could not wholly accept. His rebellion in 1877 was an elegy set to musketry, men charging with swords against rifles, courage sprinting into fire in the hope that honor might bend bullets. The modern army did not bend. On the hills of Shiroyama, the last surge of the old spirit was cut down by the very state it had defended. When the smoke cleared, Japan's warrior class survived only as a memory with a heartbeat. Yet memory is not defeat, it is transformation. Freed from the obligations of a social estate, the virtues associated with the samurai slipped into other forms. Bushido, once a practice more lived than codified, was described, debated, printed, and taught. Some romanticized it, some instrumentalized it. Many simply tried to translate its emphasis on loyalty, rectitude, and self-mastery into the language of a modern nation. The sword moved from weapon to art object, its curve admired in museums and private collections, its forging preserved by artisans who treated the furnace as both workshop and shrine. Martial disciplines shed battlefield purpose to become paths of character. Kenjutsu formalized into kendo. The principles of throwing and balance distilled into judo. Archery became kyudo, a pursuit where the target mattered less than the unity of breath, body, and intention. Factories, schools, and offices borrowed samurai vocabulary to describe virtues useful far from the field. Perseverance in study, loyalty to a team, responsibility to the whole. Literature kept the old gestures alive. Theater and later cinema gave the armor new motion. In woodblock print and photochemical frame, the warrior walked again, sometimes stern and tragic, sometimes human and conflicted. The world beyond Japan, encountering this figure on the page and screen, found in him a mirror to its own questions about honor and duty. Even stripped of his feudal context, the samurai remained a compelling answer to a timeless riddle: how to live with strength that does not devour the self. Meanwhile, the physical traces of the samurai age held their ground against weather and time. Castles rebuilt from fire and earthquake reopened as museums. Moats reflected new skylines. Stone keeps that once watched roads now watch crowds of travelers searching for angles and stories. In quiet rooms, blades rest in humidity-controlled cases, while visitors lean in to see the rippled grain of hardened steel. Evidence that beauty can be born from heat and patience. Scrolls record lineages, codes, and letters. Armor stands keep the shapes of men long gone. These objects do not mourn. They testify. If decline was inevitable, it was not simplistic. The samurai class did not fail. It completed its task. It had pacified a country, then administered it, then yielded to a structure more fit for the age of steam and cable. The values that had given it cohesion, duty to something greater than oneself, self-control in the face of fear, a sober respect for consequence, did not disappear with titles and stipends. They migrated. A new officer might salute with them. A craftsman might practice them at the bench. A student might embody them in the library at midnight. The old armor fit new bodies. Of course, no legacy is pure. The language of honor can be used to uplift or to compel, to expand the self or to erase it. The 20th century would demonstrate how easily ideals can be harnessed to purposes their original bearers might not have recognized. Yet even this ambivalence belongs to the true history of ideas. Once released, they live independent lives, shaped by need and interpretation. What endures when the misuse is stripped away is a stubborn belief that character matters, that how a person stands in the world still counts, even when no battlefield calls. So the samurai remain, not on patrol at the village gate, but in metaphors that people reach for when they need a word for steadfastness, not gathered in a lord's great hall, but in quiet practice halls where students bow before entering and learn to pay attention to small things, not shouting names across a foggy plain, but whispered into stories that parents tell their children about courage and kindness. They remain where craft is done with reverence, where promises are kept even when no one is watching, where the long way is chosen over the easy way, because the long way leaves the soul intact. Stand for a moment on a windswept castle rampart and look down at a modern city. Cars stream along avenues that once were horse paths. Electric signs spill color where torchlight once quivered. Trains take a single day to stitch together distances that messengers once rode for a week. You can feel, if you listen, two pulses beating at once, the quick tempo of the present and the deeper drum of the past. Between them lies the story of the samurai's decline and the measure of their legacy. They yielded power as history changed key, but they did not yield the music. It threads through the nation still, sometimes loud in ceremony, sometimes scarcely audible in the discipline of ordinary people who refuse to do shoddy work, who practice patience, who hold their word, as if it were made of tempered steel. In the end, the samurai did what all enduring human institutions do. They transformed from mounted archers to sword-bearing administrators, from hereditary retainers to citizens among citizens, from class to symbol. Their armor rusted, their castles burned and were rebuilt. Their swords were sheathed and set behind glass. But the shape they carved into the culture, the expectation of dignity, the training of attention, the willingness to bind power to conscience, remains. The age of the warrior closed. The idea of the warrior did not. And so the last chapter of their history is not an ending. It is a passage out of the strict duties of the past and into the broader responsibilities of memory, where the sharpest edge is the example a life leaves behind. History doesn't end, it echoes. If this journey through the samurai moved you, hit like, drop a comment with what era you want next, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Follow me for more cinematic history across platforms. Links in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious.